February 9th, 1945. 7:42 in the morning. Camp Florence, Arizona. The desert is blue with cold. Frost crackles over the barbed wire, catching the first sunlight like silver threads drawn across a sleeping kingdom. Tumbleweeds scrape against the fences, rolling aimlessly, as if looking for an escape. Behind the wire, the compound is pale and still, barracks lining neat gravel paths that cut through the sand like scars. A whistle shrieks. Roll call begins. Boots slam against frozen earth in a rhythm only half military, half human exhaustion. Staff Sergeant Daniel Price, 31, from Dayton, Ohio, adjusts his cap, squinting at the thin line of Japanese prisoners standing at attention. Most stare straight ahead, stiff, bowed at the shoulders, their uniforms stitched and patched beyond recognition. But one prisoner stands out. He is older than the rest, perhaps mid-40s, with dark, patient eyes and a way of folding his hands as if counting something invisible. At his feet lies a small, perfect paper crane. Price scowls. What the hell is that supposed to be? The prisoner glances down, then up. He answers softly, in careful English. "Peace, bird." Laughter ripples through the guards. Someone mutters, "Sure, Bird's gonna fly him right back to Tokyo." Price kicks dust toward the paper creature, and it lifts briefly on the wind before settling near the fence post, wings trembling. A few men laugh again, but the sound doesn't last. It feels wrong somehow, this fragile thing surviving mockery. His name was Haruto Mori, 44 years old, from Kyoto, Japan. Before the war, he taught calligraphy at a middle school. His hands were famous for steadiness. He smelled faintly of ink and cedar, wore wire-rimmed glasses repaired twice with string. Neighbors called him Shojin Nahito, a devout, modest man, devoted less to faith than to patience itself. When the war came, his school closed after most of the older boys enlisted. He was forced into civilian technical work, copying blueprints for supply routes. Too old for direct combat, too skilled for frontline waste. He drafted, recorded, measured, until 1943, when his convoy in New Guinea was captured after an ambush by the U.S. 7th Division. He didn't resist. He had no reason to. He'd seen too many young men lose their futures for an emperor he no longer recognized in his heart. Haruto arrived in America late that year, aboard the USS General Pope, one of 5,000 Japanese prisoners distributed across Arizona, Utah, and Texas under the Geneva Convention. He kept mostly silent through it all. He wrote in a small notebook, characters neat and geometric, and folded bits of ration paper into birds, boats, and flowers whenever boredom or memory overtook him. He said origami taught the mind to breathe through its fingers. To the guards, it was toy-making. To Haruto, it was survival. Camp Florence sat 45 miles southeast of Phoenix, one of the largest POW facilities in the American Southwest. Designed to hold 13,000 men, it sprawled across desert plains where cacti replaced forests and dust carried decades in each gust of wind. The air tasted of salt and iron. Days blistered at 85 degrees. Nights sank into the 30s. American guards, many from rural states, called it God's nowhere. Some of them resented the Japanese prisoners for being given better rations than civilians back home under meat restrictions, 3,400 calories daily by Geneva standards. Official policy dictated humane treatment, but emotions rarely complied. To the men who'd fought in the Pacific or had brothers dying at Iwo Jima, these prisoners were ghosts undeservedly alive. Still, most followed orders. Most. Sergeant Price despised the boredom more than the prisoners themselves. He'd expected loyalty tests, cunning escapes, endless vigilance. Instead, he found men who lined up, bowed, ate rice quietly, and constructed elaborate games from cigarette wrappers. And one particular prisoner, Haruto, folded birds. Every morning, before breakfast, he sat near the fence post, working meticulously with salvaged scraps of Red Cross mail wrappers. Cranes, frogs, even lanterns lined the post until the wind scattered them. Price didn't understand it. Calls it Jap nonsense. Until one morning in March, when the nonsense began to change things. The incident started with a fight. Two German POWs, labor detachment transferred for rail repair, mocked the Japanese prisoners for their submission. They spat near the kitchen line, shouted something in parody German-Japanese accent. One Japanese prisoner retaliated. A punch, then chaos. Guards rushed in, rifles raised, shouting commands. Dust rose like smoke around them. Price fired a warning shot into the air, standard regulation. The sound cracked across the compound and froze everything. And then, silence. In that stillness, Haruto stepped forward slowly, holding something small in both hands, a folded crane. He walked between the two lines, Germans still scowling, Japanese restrained, and placed the crane on the ground between them. Then he spoke, his voice trembling but steady. No more fight. The translator hesitated. One of the guards scoffed. But the fighting didn't resume. No one moved. The absurdity of it, the delicacy of origami against rifles, did something words couldn't. Later, in the guardhouse report, Price wrote only, "Disturbance resolved through nonviolent prisoner interaction." But something shifted that day. Afterward, a curious thing began to happen. At first, just a few passengers among the guards began collecting Haruto's paper cranes from the fence. Then others asked him to make some. For their wives, for children back home. He obliged every request silently, folding under the dim mess hall light. He never smiled, but his calm drew people in. Price caught himself watching, uneasy. So, one afternoon, he joined the small audience gathered near the fence as Haruto folded one of his cranes. "Why always birds?" Price asked through the interpreter. Haruto paused only briefly. "Because bird remembers sky even when caged." The answer unsettled him. 2 days later, Price returned with a square of ration paper. "Make one for my son," he said gruffly. "Name's Will." Haruto nodded, folded carefully. When he finished, he handed the crane through the fence. "Tell him to keep it near window," he said. That night, Price sat on his barrack bunk, the crane resting on his locker. Through the slit of his window, moonlight reflected off its folds. For the first time in months, the desert didn't feel entirely empty. Over the next weeks, cranes began fluttering everywhere, on mess tables, pinned above bunks, even stuck along the guard tower rails. Someone in administration called it cultural contamination. Others called it goodwill. When a Red Cross inspector visited in early May, he noted it as improvement of prisoner-guard relations through artistic expression. Washington issued no objection. Instead, an unexpected directive arrived, permission for a decorative peace festival to boost morale before repatriation discussions. Haruto was asked to organize the central display. The guards laughed at first. A festival? For prisoners? But the order stood. Under the Arizona sun, labor crews gathered scrap wood, paint, string. Haruto and a few others spent days crafting hundreds of cranes, linking them together with thread made from stripped burlap fibers and fabric from old uniforms. On June 14th, the yard transformed. A canopy of color swayed above the dust, 1,000 cranes glinting against desert light. Guards and POWs walked the same path that day, separated by custom and uniform, but not by silence. A Marine corporal who'd lost his brother at Tarawa approached Haruto quietly near the fence. You made all these? Yes. Why? Haruto's gaze flicked upward. Because men forget wind belongs to both sides. The corporal said nothing, but he bowed slightly before walking away. By late summer, the war's end was days away. Rumors spread inside the camp long before official word arrived. Guards whispered of atomic fire on distant cities. Prisoners stared westward at dusk, watching the sun vanish behind the same mountains every day. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. At Camp Florence, the announcement carried through the loudspeakers. Hostilities have ceased. No cheers, no visible relief, just silence, like the breath before dawn. That evening, Haruto unpacked his notebook and crafted one final crane. It was larger than the rest, made from a full newspaper sheet. He folded it carefully, methodically, smoothing each line as though pressing years of history flat between his fingertips. Then he handed it to Sergeant Price. "For peace between fences," he said softly. Price didn't answer. He was too choked by the weight of what that meant. He set the paper crane on the wire fence between them. It didn't fly, but it rested there, bridging two worlds neither man could ever fully understand, yet both had dared to cross. After the war, Camp Florence closed in 1946. Many of its Japanese prisoners were repatriated by year's end. No one quite remembered when Haruto left, only that he left quietly, leaving hundreds of cranes behind in the mess hall. Years later, a letter arrived at the Dayton post office addressed simply to Sergeant D. Price, America. Inside was a single line written in brushstroke English. "Paper can burn, but memory folds differently." Price kept that letter until his death in 1978. At his funeral, his daughter found a yellowed paper crane among his medals. Today, the remains of Camp Florence stand as a museum. In a glass display near the entrance, one small paper crane rests under dim light. The tag reads, "Folded by Japanese POW Haruto Mori, 1945, carried home by an American guard, symbol of peace made from war's debris." Visitors still pause there, tracing the glass with fingertips as though folding time itself. Some whisper, not sure why they're whispering. Outside, the desert wind still moves between rusting fence posts, the sound of dust brushing wire, the sound of memory learning to breathe again. And though the cranes have all but turned to dust, their lesson remains. Even a scrap of paper, folded with intent, can become a bridge strong enough to outlast hatred. Years passed, and the wind continued to sweep across the Arizona desert as if it carried the faint rustle of paper wings. By the 1960s, the barracks of Camp Florence had long been dismantled. The wood was repurposed into farm sheds, schools, and housing across Pinal County. But a handful of locals remembered what had once stood there. They spoke of the strange summer when prisoners made birds instead of weapons, and how for a few months the desert looked almost alive. One of those locals was a man named Robert Bobby Price, the son of Sergeant Daniel Price. He was 6 years old when his father first brought home the origami crane Haruto had made for him. He couldn't pronounce origami then, so he simply called it the folded bird. It sat for years on his bedroom dresser, fading from white to a soft parchment gold. When he enlisted in 1967, during another distant and painful war, he packed it with him, tucked between his Bible and a family photograph. September 4th, 1968, 6:40 a.m., Da Nang, South Vietnam. The air is a dense curtain of moisture and diesel fumes. Helicopters blade the dawn sky, pushing swamp air into the faces of soldiers trudging through the mud. Bobby Price, now private first class, checks the laces of his boots twice before stepping onto the tarmac. His father's paper crane still rests inside a waterproof pouch, taped inside his helmet. He doesn't believe in luck, but it comforts him to know it's there. That morning, his patrol is sent beyond the perimeter to retrieve wounded after an ambush. The jungle feels close and ancient, heat curling through the canopy. Every sound amplifies, the cry of distant birds, the clatter of branches, and, above all, the suffocating buzz of insects. Halfway through the search zone, a firefight erupts. Price dives for cover, behind a fallen palm, dirt spurting before his eyes. Close fire, too close. He reaches for his rifle, gloved fingers trembling, and the paper crane slips from the pouch, tumbling into the mud at his knee. For a second, amid chaos, he stares at it. The fragile shape from another war, another desert, shimmering faintly beneath Vietnam's rain. Something in that moment steadies him. He fires, covers, moves instinctively, his mind ringing with one absurd thought: make sure the bird survives. When the firefight ends, 3 men are dead, 5 wounded. Bobby's left hand burns from shrapnel, but the crane is unhurt. He wipes it clean, watches the soaked folds stiffen, and thinks of his father, and of the nameless man who had folded it for him in a camp across the ocean 23 years before. That night, he writes home. Dad, I think the bird worked. Or maybe what you taught me did. Either way, I'm still here. The letter reaches Ohio 2 weeks after a telegram already informing his parents that he's been wounded in action. His father, sitting at the kitchen table, reads the final line 3 times, then quietly replaces it in the envelope. That bird's got more tours than half the army, he jokes to his wife, but his voice shakes slightly. Act 2. Another fold in time. Meanwhile, in Kyoto, Haruto Mori is very much alive. He returned to Japan in 1946 aboard the USS General Sturgis, part of the second repatriation convoy. Japan, when he saw it again, felt smaller, quieter, and hollowed out. His family home near Kiyomizu Temple had survived the air raids, but many neighbors had not. His wife, Aya, greeted him with shock that deepened into pride when she saw the smoothness of his hands, hands that, against all odds, had survived without violence. Haruto resumed teaching, though his classroom no longer bore the emperor's portrait. He taught origami now, not calligraphy, reasoning that paper folding was a kind of written language anyway. His students laughed at his calm, but listened closely when he told them each crane carried a story worth keeping. Every summer, he folded cranes for those lost to the war, American and Japanese alike, and placed them in the Kamo River. He never forgot Sergeant Price. In 1954, he managed to learn that Price had returned to Ohio through a veteran's bulletin. Haruto began writing a letter in halting English to thank him for what he called mercy between fences. The letter was never sent. He tore it in half, unable to find a polite way to sign it. In Japanese, arigato, arigato seemed too small a word for so heavy a gratitude. Still, he kept the halves of that letter inside a drawer, wrapped in cloth, an unfinished fold. In 1972, when photographs of the Vietnam War's devastation appeared in Japanese newspapers, Haruto clipped one of a small girl running down a road, wounded and screaming. He tucked it beside the unsent letter and whispered to himself, "The birds must keep flying." That year, he organized his students to send 1,000 cranes to America, to hospitals treating Vietnam veterans. No one paid much attention. Most were thrown away. But one set of cranes reached a hospital in San Francisco, folded from recycled Japanese textbooks, smaller than a child's palm. A nurse placed one on the nightstand of a recovering soldier, a young man named Robert Price. When Bobby awoke, the paper bird looked strangely familiar. He touched it gently and laughed. "You made it here too, huh?" The nurse smiled. donated by Japanese school kids. They said they were for peace, not pity. He nodded quietly and asked if he could keep it. She said yes. When he returned to Ohio, 2 cranes, one desert-born, one foreign, rested side by side on his windowsill. The first fragile, yellowing. The second, bright white and new. His father told him then, for the first time, about Camp Florence, about the man who had folded the first one. Bobby listened, his burned hand moving unconsciously along the creases. Haruto Mori, he repeated, slowly, as if trying to memorize the rhythm. I wish I could meet him. You already have, Daniel said softly. Every time you didn't hate someone who gave you reason. The 2 men never met in life, but the connection took a tangible shape. In 1983, a Japanese-American historian at the University of Arizona published an article titled The Peace Birds of Camp Florence. It referenced archival photos taken by guards, among them a close-up of Haruto, kneeling in the dirt with a crane between his palms. That article crossed the Pacific, appearing in Kyoto papers, where Haruto's granddaughter, Yui, saw it. She contacted the American author, who forwarded her message to the museum in Arizona that maintained Price's old letters. Within months, correspondence began between the families. Through translators, they exchanged memories and fragments. Yui wrote, My grandfather said origami is the writing of patience. Each fold a word for what can't be spoken aloud. Bobby answered, Then maybe our families have been letter writers for a long time, without knowing it. In 1989, Yui visited the Arizona desert. Together, she and Bobby stood before the Camp Florence plaque, under a washed-out sky. She placed a modern packet of cranes at its base, 500 on her grandfather's behalf, 500 for Daniel Price. I think they would have been friends, Bobby said. Yui nodded. They already are. In the decades that followed, the story of Camp Florence continued to travel quietly between museums, classrooms, and veterans' journals. Teachers used it to discuss the Geneva Convention. Artists recreated Haruto's cranes in installations stretching between 2 suspended fences. But perhaps the most lasting echo appeared in 2019, when an elderly Japanese visitor to the museum leaned forward in his wheelchair to look at the single surviving crane under glass. He was small, white-haired, his suit wrinkled. When asked why he'd come so far, he smiled. Because my teacher never finished his final fold. He unfolded from his jacket pocket a thin sheet of rice paper. Slowly, trembling, he folded it once, twice, 12 times more, each movement deliberate, measured, a ritual. When he finished, he placed it beside the old crane and whispered, Korede chiao ga wanchung shita. With this, the bridge is complete. Then he bowed and walked away. That man was Yui's father, Haruto's son, Akira Mori, 91 years old, the last living memory of that generation. Today, visitors can listen to the museum's audio guide explaining how 2 enemies connected through fragments of scrap paper beneath the Arizona sun. Children make new cranes beside the exhibit table, their fingers slow, learning patience. Outside, desert wind hums against the wire fence remnants, soft, almost like wings unfolding. And beyond the museum, carried quietly by the air, stories of those who once folded their sorrow into something that could fly continue. Somewhere, between sand and sky, it still feels as if one final crane drifts above them all, unfurling the lesson Haruto left for anyone willing to see. That even in war's harshest silence, the smallest act of care can teach the hands to shape peace. But the story doesn't end there. A century is approaching since those men first met in the dust. In 2045, plans are already proposed for a peace park between Kyoto and Florence, a mirrored sculpture of cranes cast in glass, positioned so that morning in one country aligns with sunset in the other. Its title was chosen from Haruto's notebook, found years after his death, in a line of soft English written in fountain ink. A bridge that folds, a bridge that endures. And maybe that is all history ever tries to do, to fold pain back toward grace, one fragile crease at a time. April 17, 2045. 5:31 p.m., Kyoto, Japan. The Kamo River glows with floating paper lanterns, each shaped not like the traditional cube, but like cranes, wings edged with candlelight. School children in blue uniforms guide them gently onto the water. Across the riverbank stand parents, veterans, tourists, and diplomats. Their voices merge into one low hum that sounds almost like wind through paper. The dedication ceremony begins at dusk. On the screen behind the stage, two black and white photographs emerge. The first of Haruto Mori, kneeling in the dirt beneath Arizona sun. The second of Sergeant Daniel Price holding a crane in rough, calloused hands. A translator reads their respective lines once whispered long ago. Because bird remember sky even when caged. For peace between fences. The crowd falls entirely silent. Over loudspeakers, a recording plays. The faint desert wind captured from the Camp Florence site, mixed with the sound of folding paper. Then, across the river, mirrored panels catch the last of the sunlight. Slowly, as the panels shift, the reflection reveals the twin sculpture, an enormous crane rendered in translucent glass, its wingspan 6 meters across. And at that exact same moment, thousands of miles away, across the Pacific, an identical crane rises from the Arizona plains. Through careful design, sunlight at dawn in Florence meets sunset in Kyoto, bathing both monuments simultaneously in gold. Standing amid the Kyoto audience is a woman named Naomi Price, great-granddaughter of both families, her American grandmother having married into the Mori line decades before. She's a cultural historian, mid-30s, carrying an origami set folded from archival paper. From a respectful distance, she places two cranes at the edge of the river, one yellow, one white, and bows her head. A journalist nearby asks, "Are they for your ancestors?" "No," she says softly. "They're for the ones we still treat like enemies." The reporter hesitates, unsure whether it's a message or confession. Naomi looks up at the sky blooming orange over Kyoto. "They built this as a bridge," she continues, "but maybe it's really a mirror. It shows us who we were and who we could still be." That same morning in Arizona, a small crowd gathers around what's now called the Peace Field. The desert air carries sage and dust, and a wind strong enough to lift grains that glitter like mica. Beside the glass crane, a museum guide reads from one of Haruto's teaching notebooks, found in a Kyoto archive and digitized for the event. To fold is to yield temporarily, so that a shape can emerge stronger. Nations may do the same. So may hearts. Visitors stand quietly, children, veterans, descendants of guards and prisoners alike. One of them, an elderly woman named Fumiko Hernandez, leans on her cane. Her grandfather had been a young cook at Camp Florence. She whispers, "They laughed at the cranes, you know. But when I was a child, he told me those folds were the most respectful silence he ever saw." The guide nods. "When he said silence, he meant peace," she replies. A gust rises suddenly, whirling past the sculpture. It lifts dozens of ceremonial paper cranes into the air, replicas printed with names of former POWs and guards. They scatter, some caught in fences, some flying high enough to become indistinguishable from the desert horizon. Those who witness it swear that one crane lands exactly where the original wire fence line once stood and remains there, trembling against the wind but refusing to fall. That evening, streams in both countries run bright with reflected candlelight and cell phone flashes, glowing across 2 continents. The news headline reads, "Shared Sky. Peace Bridge aligns Japan and U.S. sunrise for the first time." Underneath, an editorial runs a single closing line. "Paper burns, steel rusts, but goodwill, once folded across distance, retains its shape." In the following months, school textbooks in both nations include short lessons on Camp Florence, not for its statistics, but for its humanity. Students read Haruto's quote beside prices and discuss how unlikely gestures shape history as deeply as battles do. Origami workshops spread through schools, and museum visitors now leave cranes as petitions for peace in other troubled parts of the world: Ukraine, Taiwan, Sudan. The librarian overseeing the exhibit keeps a log of every message found inside. Each crane carries names, apologies, or simple words. "I forgive," "I hope," "I remember." The notebooks are stored in climate-controlled drawers, not far from where the last original crane still rests, fragile and faded, but intact. When new curators dust the glass each morning, the faint desert light filters through its brittle folds, projecting a shadow shaped like open wings across the wall. And with that light, almost no one notices the breeze that creeps through the corridor windows. Dry, very slight, but enough to make the glass tremble, as though drawing breath. For a moment that passes unseen, the shadow on the wall seems to move again. A wing, lifting. A bridge, alive. Between 2 worlds that once feared each other, the motion continues. A simple act repeating across generations. One fold, then another, until the world learns that peace, like paper, becomes stronger, not by being unbroken, but by being carefully remade. The following winter, the bridge between Kyoto and Florence began attracting visitors, not only for its symbolism, but for another, quieter reason. Every New Year's Eve, without official coordination, groups of people from both sides of the Pacific began folding cranes together at the same hour, 9 p.m. Arizona time, noon in Japan. Some participated virtually, others in desert parks or along riverbanks, each following the same rule. Every crane must contain a message, not of politics, but of memory. January 1st, 2046, 12:03 p.m. in Kyoto, still 9:03 p.m. in Florence. At the Command Center for the Peace Bridge Initiative, technicians monitor synchronized feeds linking both monuments. On one screen, Japanese children kneel beside baskets of paper. On another, American veterans and students sit on blankets spread across cold desert stone. The camera catches gestures more than words, fingers repeating the same slow folds, paper rustling faintly against the wind. A girl in Kyoto whispers, "Korei Hashui no tameni?" "Who is this for?" Her teacher replies, "Subete no shiwareta koen no tameni," for every lost voice. In Arizona, a veteran of Afghanistan, one arm made from carbon fiber, folds a square with patient effort. He smiles as he mimics the shape taught by a 9-year-old beside him. "Funny," he mutters, "how peace and war both come down to what hands do." When they release the cranes, drones hover above to capture the sight. Thousands of fragile shapes riding the winter currents, scattering like luminous snow. Even through the broadcast delay, the Japanese crowd gasps simultaneously with the Americans as the cranes rise and scatter, their wings catching sunlight and moonlight at once, the 2 skies briefly merging. Months later, during a digital preservation project at the Camp Florence Museum, curators uncover something extraordinary. Behind a discolored photo frame lies a sealed envelope, the kind used in Red Cross correspondence during 1945. Its paper is brittle, labeled from H. Mori, POW, Jarbier 44, to D. Price, Camp Florence. It had apparently been misplaced during post-war repatriation and embedded by error in an archival box. The wax seal, remains unbroken. After careful debate, the museum decides to open it publicly during the annual Remembrance Ceremony. On June 14, 2046, in front of historians and descendants, the curator reads fragments aloud. The handwriting is small, careful. "Sergeant Price," it begins, "I wish to thank you for keeping silence when others mocked. You allowed me to fold. Perhaps one day, you will return to teaching me your kind of courage. Origami is the art of bending without breaking. Maybe peace is too, you and I, two hands of one fold." At the bottom, in brushstroke English letters, one phrase repeats 3 times, each smaller than the last. "For peace between fences, for peace between fences, for peace between fences." Everyone in the hall stands unmoving. Then slowly, Naomi Price wipes her eyes and whispers, "He sent it, and we're still answering." In years that follow, the bridge's story enters art, literature, and even classrooms across both nations. A Japanese anime series retells it as a tale of a teacher who folds birds to hold back a sandstorm. An American poet writes a volume entitled 31 Folds of Light. By 2050, UNESCO designates the Peace Bridge and Camp Florence sites as Shared Cultural Heritage of Humanity. That same decade, humanity faces new dividing lines: water scarcity, climate migration, distrust between nations. Yet each generation, someone returns to the lesson written in Haruto Mori's letter. Bending without breaking. One environmental alliance even adopts the crane as its symbol, calling it Origami Earth, a globe folded into flight. They quote from Daniel Price's wartime report stored in microfilm: "Disturbance resolved through nonviolent prisoner interaction." Those sterile military words are now carved, in translation, under both monuments, a paradox turned into scripture. Summer 2055. The 10th Peace Bridge anniversary brings another generation. Naomi's daughter, Hana, records the event for a documentary. In the opening shot, she sets a single crane afloat on the Kamo River and narrates, "My grandmother's great-grandfather folded the first crane in a prison. Today, my mother teaches children to fold them in playgrounds. Maybe peace will never be permanent. But then, neither is paper. We keep folding anyway." Her voice fades under the sound of rustling wings. A cut splices directly to the Arizona sunrise, drones tracing the long shadow of the glass crane stretching across desert hills. Underneath, the words appear exactly as Haruto once wrote, translated again: "A bridge that folds, a bridge that endures." And through successive centuries, the story remains not as legend, but as ritual, a proof that gestures speak where languages fail. Because somewhere on a quiet morning each February, when frost shimmers above the fence posts that no longer imprison anyone, desert air warms just enough to stir the museum's last original crane. It trembles once, twice, its shadow still crossing glass, then settles again. And anyone who happens to see it swear they can hear the faintest whisper rushing through the air, like faraway paper sliding over wood, whispering in 2 tongues that have long since learned to share their silence. Ping he no tameni, for peace.